thank you again for everyone tuning in and joining us for our quick webinar on quantifying yeast costs. I guess first we'll introduce ourselves. My name's Devin. I'm the technical education coordinator here at White Labs, and we also have the one giving our presentation, Jacob, who is our sales development specialist. Jacob, you want to introduce yourself for a bit or your background?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Thanks for hopping on this morning or early afternoon, depending on where you're at. I appreciate you taking the time. My name's Jacob Hoover. I've been with White Labs going on over 6 years now. Started as a newly undergraduate in biological science and started the company. Kind of got into obviously like a lot of the sensory tasting beer, Cicerone, BJCP stuff. Started working in our education department through that, and then moved into a sales role after moving out back east where I'm from. So now I oversee the Mid-Atlantic and New England region. So if you're in that area, shout out to you guys. And still passionate about the science of it, pursuing a master's degree currently, and excited to give this presentation on some ways to conceptually think about your yeast cost.
Yeah. So pretty much, yeah, like what Jacob was saying is a lot of this basis or creation of this webinar that we found is, yeah, we understand the struggles that everyone's going through. We understand the state of the industry and all that. So we're here to help out and try to help you get the most out of your yeast, help try to quantify certain costs and try to get the most generations for your yeast to help reduce cost. So that's where a lot of this creation came to mind, and we're always there to try to help and aid in that process. I know based off of these questions, we do have a really quick poll that we would like to give to just see what everyone is currently doing on their yeast costing to see what sort of budget everyone's in. So I'm going to open this poll, and if everyone could answer some of these questions, it's just one question on what you guys are currently looking at for some of your yeast costs or target cost per barrel for yeast.
Yeah, as you're doing this poll, I guess there should have been another option. I could have added just saying maybe you don't have this as your quantification of cost. I think that's an important thing that I'll discuss throughout this presentation, is that after speaking with a lot of breweries throughout the travels, like conferences and brewery visits, I've found that a lot of brewers or owners don't have this well quantified, and it's one of the ingredients and aspects of brewing that may be maybe lacking in that area. So that was also an inspiration for giving this talk today. So if you don't have one, maybe just take a guess or just answer, and then we'll kind of talk about how we would go about quantifying it. It may help you determine it after this presentation.
Sweet. And then I guess the last thing is, well, during this presentation, feel free to use the Q&A function to ask questions, and then we'll try to address most of them or all of them at the end of this presentation. But yeah, Jacob, I think we could start the screen share and get this party started.
All right, great. 1 second.
And I guess, Jacob, can you see the poll results, or should I end the poll? Sorry.
I cannot see.
All right, let me end the poll. Let me give it 10 more seconds, and then we keep on going. Seems like the poll results, let's see. Let's share the results. Seems like, yeah, a majority right now is around that 5 to 15 cost per barrel, or the 15 to 30 around. So
Okay,
yeah.
great. Yeah, this is super interesting. So I appreciate you all for participating in this poll. Yeah, my guess was going to be between like 10 and 20 was going to be the sweet spot. So that's what it seems based off these number ranges, that's kind of where a lot of you are at. So yeah, thank you. Interesting data. All right, so to get started, as Devin was saying, the last I guess year to 2 years, like a lot of the post-COVID time. We all know that the industry has shifted a little bit. It's no secret. As I travel around to these conferences, listen to a lot of the BA talks about the current state of the industry throughout these different states. They're all along the same tune. The market is kind of leveling out. There's like a one in, one out kind of situation, which hasn't existed in the time that most of us have been in the industry. And so we have noticed that breweries and owners are taking a closer look at a lot of their expenses, and yeast being one of those. It's a large expense. The beauty of it is that you can essentially do your own propagation and reuse it multiple times. So because of that, there's not a tried and true, or at least I haven't been able to find tried and true way of quantifying this. So we put together presentation on all the things that we've been working on internally to help conceptually give you a train of thought that will hopefully lead you to a better understanding of your situation, what's the best for that situation, and maybe some things that you can implement to get better. So I'll kind of move it along into some learning objectives. So the flow of this presentation is the way we would recommend just thinking about a yeast culture before you ever bring it into the brewery till the time it's spent and you need to get a fresh culture. So understanding what you're bringing in, where it's coming from, how it's made. There's differences. Yeast can come in liquid or dry formats. There's many manufacturers out there today, and the methods of propagation do differ. So just kind of having an intimate understanding of where the product's coming from. This is common in other ingredients. This is common with malt and COAs, and this is common in hops. People fly all the time to do their to sign contracts and test out hops. So they understand the farm, they understand the growers. So it's kind of the same train of thought with with yeast. I just don't or haven't had the experience of talking with a lot of people that maybe go through the same level of thoroughness as these other ingredients. So we'll talk a little bit about that to start off. Then we'll talk about just once you have it and you use it for the first time, how do we manage that health? How do we determine if it is healthy for your use, and how do we get the best flavor production? Then how do we properly collect, store, and repitch it so that we maintain it? This is where that value is going to come from. This is where we're going to see the savings involved. And lastly, we'll talk about some methods that you can employ. They aren't going to be applicable to everyone because they're very much based off production capacity and brewery size, but some work well for your situation, some might not work. So we'll talk about maybe you'll see something here that you could start employing. That these are all great ways of maximizing the use of your yeast cultures. So kind of going back to that thought of thinking about the culture from the manufacturer before bringing it in and determining what's best for your situation. I want to emphasize that's really the point that I'm trying to make here is that this is very situational based, and different products can be right for you in different settings. So I'm not trying to say one thing is better than the other. I'm just trying to point out like some ways to think about this before selecting a certain product or strain. So I like this graphic because it really shows that half of the importance, you could say, or half of the quality that will go into your finished product, your finished beer, it happens before you ever receive that fresh pitch of yeast. So we have, this culture collection, laboratory culture propagation, and then brewery scale culture propagation. So these are kind of the steps in the facility. At White Labs, talking about really caring about caring about value these days, caring about cost, really trying to help because we know this is a big conversation in the industry. We've been employing this in the propagation facility for years now to ensure that the cell is in the utmost quality for brewery use, because we spend 21 days in propagation growing these yeast cells, and that's a very long time compared to some of the other manufacturers growing yeast. We could grow yeast in a shorter amount of time, but I like to equate it to the idea of as we go slower, we're building up this healthy metabolism. We're building up healthy cellular components, getting sufficient proteins for metabolism produced. We are building healthy cell membranes so that they're able to transport everything they need to in and out of the cell. And this is, like I said, I like to equate this to, if we talk about humans rather than a yeast cell, we're both eukaryotes. We're similar in that manner. And if we're trying to prepare for something that's metabolically active, maybe physically active, maybe a sporting event or athletic event, and we're training for this, the rushing that may not have the same benefits as training over a longer span of time. If we're thinking about maybe like lung capacity or muscle growth, things like that, these things take time to build healthy, strong cellular processes, and the same can be equated to cells, yeast cells for fermentation, because these cells undergo stress, and if they're not fortified with the proper machinery to handle that stress, then maybe that health won't be able to be prolonged for as many generations. Maybe the flavor production is going to be less complex, maybe muted in some ways. So we've been doing this. We just haven't been talking about this as much in the light of really helping get value out of it. But that's what we've been doing through this 21-day propagation and through these patented process that we employ at White Labs. And that's where that quality comes in at the propagation facility. So that once you get to the brewery, you're able to really reap the benefits of that and see the value on the back end of that first pitch or that culture use. Some things to point out about the lab grown culture, just to think about. These are really quick, just about why why the quality is there. Well, there's really no stressors in the propagation at the facility. The process is tailored, very fine-tuned over years of research to ensure there's very little stress and that the environment is set up perfectly for propagating. So low alcohol, based off of the the aeration process. They're growing in a lot of oxygen. The cell physiology is meant to be built up to the healthiest it can be. A lot of glycogen, which is a storage, is kind of signal for storage use, for sugar storage for while the yeast is being in package waiting to get to the brewery. So this is good for shelf life. They're at really high viability, so a lot of living cells, and there's not really any other kind of matter in that other than the liquid from the all malt wort that's now spent, that's just creating the liquid yeast culture. All right, so now this is something that is, this isn't new. Planning and scheduling out your brewery production schedule. This is, I know this is recommended by other people, but I don't want to just scoff this off, because I think this is an area where there's a lot of savings to be had for many breweries. And this can be, a month of scheduling. This can be a quarterly schedule, a biannual schedule, a yearly schedule, whatever works for you. But I will say that I do believe that ordering last minute or planning last minute over the span of a year will have a negative effect on the value you're able to get out of cultures. That's just as a whole. And then if you extrapolate that, say 5 years, thinking about the future, like that could be a large amount of savings that could have been lost due to planning and scheduling just inconsistencies. And so definitely want to think about, when you're bringing in the culture, what's going to be used in or what it could be used in to fit, whatever styles are being produced at that time of the year. How often is it going to be used? This is very different based off if you're a 1-barrel brewery or a 20-barrel brewery. How often will it be used? Is it a house culture? Is it specialty culture? And maybe create, if you want to get down to the nitty-gritty too, like some estimated fermentation timelines, or create a standard for what you see, because fermentation timelines, like knowing when you harvest, that has benefits outside of just scheduling and planning. That has benefits also with with yeast health, which we'll talk about in a few slides. But here's an example of like a house ale yeast, and some styles you could use it in. Pretty basic, but like the point with the Belgian wheat yeast or any kind of specialty strain that I'd like to make, this is an area for a good amount of savings too, because we're all going to be making specialty beers at different seasons, and these are usually the ones that excite us the most to brew and try. But if you're able to just incorporate one more use or two more uses of that strain in another style that may be similar or fun and like be creative, can fit your clientele, excuse me, that will, I mean, each time you do that, it reduces your cost in half. So over the span, like I said, of 1 to 5 years, like that, every specialty strain trying to utilize that same train of thought, that could lead to some pretty considerable savings. Don't forget to plan and schedule and document. Don't forget which beer this came from and what gravity it was. Take data on the quality of the fermentation. I'll get to that in a minute too, so that you know that the yeast is still chugging along, and know what generation that culture is on, just in case you have SOPs in place for generational use, what you're comfortable with, what you've seen with a certain brand once it gets to a certain culture, or I'm sorry, a certain generation. So the big thing here is gravity. We're talking about increasing gravity as you go along. Don't pitch your yeast into a high gravity beer right away. I've worked with customers that have done this. I will always recommend not doing that. But those customers have seen success where they've pitched into a double IPA, moved it to a double IPA, moved it to a triple IPA. And they have seen success. And I think it's a testament to the yeast cell and the quality, but that won't get the same generational use as if you employ this method. And also the upfront cost needed for that large gravity beer is much, much higher, right? That the stress of a high gravity wort is much higher on yeast cell, which prevents the yeast cells from growing in that exponential growth phase, that first 48, 72 hours. So to negate the side effects of what would be under pitching, you need to pitch more yeast up front into higher gravity beers. They grow a little bit less, but then you still have that total cell population required to ferment that beer. But yeah, this comes at a higher cost. So in this example, starting it in a 12 Plato beer and moving it up to eventually getting to your 20 plus Plato beers, you're not only getting that harvest and reuse, that generational savings, but you're also now getting to make that beer for a fraction of the cost. So just definitely think about these concepts when scheduling and planning and thinking about brewing some different styles. They will make a big difference, I promise. All right. At this point, you have decided what you're bringing in. You have planned it out, and you're now using it for the first time. Well, this is applicable to any time you ferment, but just through our chronological order here. And this is showing that growth phase in yeast. So we have the lag phase, exponential growth phase, stationary, and then when cells start to flocculate out and settle out once fermentation is coming towards an end. The big thing here is, and what I would recommend that you always do, is monitor and record your attenuation and your pH throughout the entire fermentation, but you really want to look at it in terms of quality of the yeast culture for that first 48 to 72 hours, because that right there can basically tell you if the yeast is viable and has the vitality or the health to be reused after harvest, right there in the first 48 hours. And then what you can do with this data, that's super simple. I know there's other companies that help with this type of data, fermentation data, but also like you can just take a spreadsheet, enter this, create graphs just showing this drop, which we'll have some coming up from our brewery. And you can overlay each fermentation if it's a beer that you're using a lot or you're producing a lot. Overlay those graphs and you'll start seeing means. And that's a great way of showing that, like, okay, this is quality. It's quality fermentation. This is a quality yeast culture. The beer is behaving how I expect. And any deviations, you can set standard deviations as part of your SOP for quality determination. And any deviations you see would let you know, okay, maybe this culture isn't something that I want to reuse again. And that can be really valuable, and it's very simple to do. Some other requirements think about. Luckily, beer and brewing, a lot of these are supplied for us through the barley, and you got carbohydrates, the sugars coming from barley typically. We have the amino acids needed to build proteins coming from the barley. This is you only really need to think about this if you're making like very low gravity beers where maybe you're not getting enough amino acids, or if you're making high adjunct beers where you're also having a lower barley grist ratio. And then vitamins too, another thing that's usually sufficiently supplied by barley. The big things with yeast to think about are oxygen and minerals like zinc. Zinc specifically is something that it's nothing new. It's been known to be a crucial cofactor in many of the enzymes yeast use for a ton of different cellular operations, but predominantly the one that is most often talked about in fermentation is it's a cofactor in the process of producing ethanol. And by yeast having enough zinc, they will be able to ferment in an extremely healthy. It reduces the stress on the cell when it doesn't have that zinc cofactor. It's kind of harder for it to work. So by having it, it's going to ferment extremely healthy and sufficiently. It's going to produce really great flavor profile, a consistent flavor profile, and through that promotional health, you'll be able to use it more times. So there's a lot of benefits here. In terms of cost, tank residency times being lower and getting more generations out of your culture, those two right there are huge cost saving opportunities. And we just released a cold side zinc edition product called Zinc Buddy. I think the product code is WN 4700. It comes in 1 liter Nalgene's, and doing the math on this, like per dose, I'm sorry, per barrel, it's about 36 cents per barrel. So at 36 cents per barrel, if tank residency time or generational use, if either of those things are benefited at all, that's it's a pretty good ROI on that product. And then oxygen is the other thing that can be manipulated and is very important. Oxygen plays a crucial role in cellular division. So in that first 48, 72 hours, like I said, sterols from the dead yeast cells. In the case of liquid yeast that don't have that, oxygen is going to be used to build a sufficient sterile and cellular membrane so that cells may divide. So this is really oxygen becomes really important to avoid underpitching effects where maybe division is hindered, and you could see poor flavor production, off flavors, under attenuation, or if it's really bad, if you have really bad under pitching effects, it could be stalled or stuck as well. And I like to just put this up. I think this is a great graphic to show just a minute look into everything the yeast cell is doing in terms of flavor. Flavor is controlled so much by the yeast cell. We see this in our 2 facilities in San Diego and Asheville all the time, where we do the same batch of wort, we split it and we ferment each half with a different yeast strain. It really gives us a look into how yeast can manipulate the flavor production, and not just flavor, but like the body perception, the aroma, like levels of aroma, a ton of different things. And so I like to point this out because regardless of cost and getting more value, really paying attention to what's creating the best flavor. So this is a balance game. I like to talk about this as like a balance game of where you're trying to make sure that you're making a product that is hitting that flavor profile that you're intending, that you're happy with, that fits your brand, and that your consumer is going to be happy with, while also making sure that it makes sense as a business, right? So we're trying to balance these things, and I don't think that they have to be inhibitory. I think you can get a great flavor profile with the proper techniques and SOPs and thought process behind yeast cultures, maybe some trialing and testing. You can get a great flavor profile and still maintain a very low cost. So just when you think about yeast, think about flavor. That's a big, fun key takeaway here that I like to point out. Some just kind of tips and tricks to the trade of collection and storage. I'm sure many of you have seen this before, but yeah, you want to collect the healthy yeast slurry in the middle of the cone typically, but you want to limit the time it's in the cone. You want to be wary of temperature because yeast is an insulating factor. So there can be hot spots in the middle, which will deplete glycogen storage in the cell. Essentially at that point, the cell is going to die. So it's going to lower viability of the culture overall, or if not lower viability, lower the vitality, the health of the cell, so that when it goes into the next batch, it may not be as ready to go. The amount of slurry you get will be strain dependent. Yeast cells are different sizes, and they will be at different total cell populations depending on things like oxygenation, original gravity, tank geometry, things like that. So the big thing here is just you want to harvest it as soon as possible. The yeast in your cone is no longer fermenting; it's no longer cleaning up diacetyl. The yeast that's doing that is still in suspension, so there's no harm in getting it out if you have a slurry that's sufficient for harvest and repitching. So some good things to think about there. And then with storage, treat it like you would beer. This is a great way of thinking about it. Keep the temperature low. You want to eliminate any possibility of metabolic activity. You want to make sure it's you want to try to maintain a short storage time. 2 to 3 weeks. Like 2 weeks is especially if you're not taking viability, and you don't have maybe a microscope to do that. I would recommend 2 weeks being a pretty limiting timeline for you. If you do have the possibility of taking viability, then you can look at it after 2 weeks. Typically you see 4 weeks when like things start dropping pretty quickly. And then this is also routinely based. So like if you view this a few times, if you view viability a few times at a certain timeline, then you can get comfortable with that culture. The big thing is becoming comfortable with the culture that you're using, get to know it what it looks like. If you have a microscope, or you can get to know it without a microscope as well. If you're storing it and you don't have that and you're not taking viability, but you are seeing consistent fermentations and everything is looking good, smelling good, you should be good. Avoid oxygen pickup. That will also trigger metabolism. And then a really big thing that we've seen through trials of the development of like our flex brink, which is a sterilized brink designed for smaller fermenters. Really great product for people that aren't harvesting currently. Super easy to use. In those trials, we found that CO2 pressure is a huge stress that will lower viability very quickly. And so be sure to vent that stored slurry daily. It's very important for maintaining that viability over time. Yeah. Okay, so how do I determine if the culture is good to be reused? So here's some graphs that I mentioned I would show. This is just attenuation and pH, but you can see at the pH graph here, this is I believe this was going to be a porter that we would have brewed, where we split it between our 004 Irish ale yeast and our 810 San Francisco lager yeast. You can see the pH drops here. They look really, really healthy. In the first 2 days, you see my point here. First 2 days they drop considerably. So the 0 to 2 day drop is really what you want to see, and this is going to be different by strain. So building this, and then the next time we brew a porter, overlaying the same those on top of this, et cetera, over and over again, is a great way of determining if this culture is behaving how you expect it to. Getting to know your yeast culture. I'll say it again. Get to know it. Is it behaving like I expect it to? And that's so crucial for repitching, making sure that culture is ready to go for the next batch. So looking at lag times, as it says here, monitor that 48 hours, like I'm mentioning. How long does it take? You want a rhythm for these fermentations where they're behaving the same way. If they're taking longer, that means there's been a deviation, and the yeast is more stressed. Like it's typically going to be a stress-induced issue for whatever reason. That's where the troubleshooting comes in. But that's a quick, easy way to determine, okay, I need a fresh culture from somewhere, whether it's another brink I have or from a manufacturer, and then improving upon those troubleshooting opportunities and SOPs is how you continue to improve upon your value and reduce costs. Look at attenuation, harvest volumes, and biomass. That's really big too. On the opposite, so like right now we're looking at the very beginning of fermentation, but talking about the opposite end, when you're going to harvest the slurry, if you're seeing a lower biomass or a higher biomass, then there's been some deviation in some aspect, oxygen, pitch rate. At some point, something changed, right? So those are both great ways to maintain quality and consistency. Additionally, if you have a lab, so these are things you can do without a lab, and these things are sufficient to make great beer and to reuse yeast. If you have proper SOPs in place and you're very in touch with what's going on in these fermentations, in touch with your cultures, you can do this without any issues and make great beer. But if you do have a lab, or if you do have a microscope, microscope's pretty much all you need, just to take some cell counts and viability. The benefits of this is you can verify the viability is high, and you can also so then you can maybe like extend generational use if you're seeing consistent flavor production. You don't have to just say like, I'm comfortable at this point. I'm happy with the target cost. I am fine getting a new culture. That might be your decision making without a microscope. But with a microscope, you might be able to say, okay, well, maybe I can get a couple more based on this viability, and the other benefit in terms of consistency, which could also play a role in generational use, is the cell count, because the cell count will allow you to determine your slurry concentration of that harvest, and that will allow you to calculate a targeted pitch rate for those batches, so you can really dial in how much yeast you're adding. There's no real risk of over pitching or under pitching. Under pitching has its negative effects that I kind of mentioned before. Over pitching, not as much, but those cells are going to age faster. They're not dividing as much, so you don't have as many new cells. And you really want new cells when you're fermenting a new batch. You don't want old cells, because then they're going. I mean, they're at the end of their life. They're not going to be dividing as much if you need them to in the future. And so that is, the one small risk with if you're over pitching by a lot, just to think about that. So that's a big benefit just in terms of consistency, is being able to take cell counts and calculate a pitching rate. Think of it as part of your recipe. A pitching rate is part of your recipe, so you really want to dial that in, just like you dial in all the other factors. So that is a big benefit there. It is not required though. That's the point I'm trying to make. So here's a look at some spreadsheets we have that can just help us give quick recommendations to our customers that maybe don't have exact cell concentrations with microscopes and things like that. We have this for weight in pounds and kilograms. We have this for volume in liters and gallons. This particular one is just a quick look at weight in pounds. So you see here, this is not accounting for the weight of the keg, which is about 30 pounds. So this is just going to be the weight of the yeast slurry. And we're assuming that the cell concentration of the harvest is 1.5 billion cells per milliliter. This can range, and that's why a cell count can be beneficial. But typically, you're seeing like anywhere from 1 to 1.5. It can be higher, it can be lower. But for this, just for this example, we use 1.5. I think it gives us a good baseline, and then from there we can kind of recommend a range plus or minus, say, a few pounds, depending on a percentage, kind of like a acceptable deviation from the exact range, and that should hopefully cover a healthy repitching rate. So this is the pitch rate of this is going to match our recommended pitch rate of 7.5 million cells into a standard gravity ale at ale fermentation temperatures. And we have the barrelage on the left. So if you're a 10-barrel brewery, you kind of scan over. And if you're estimating viability because you don't have a microscope, you can kind of target where you think you're at. And then if you do have a microscope, you can get more exact. But yeah, you can see here how the repitch volume, or I'm sorry, weight is going to go up the lower the viability gets because you have less living cells in that slurry. So you need to add more volume so you get more living cells into your beer. I recommend maybe creating one of these in-house. It's not too tough to create, and it could just be a great reference just to glance at, or you know, for training purposes, things like that. Okay, so those are all great ways to maintain fermentation quality and monitor it. Let's talk really briefly about some methods. So when going into maximizing yeast value, some of the questions to think about, what is your target cost for your business? I know we pulled that in the beginning, and this is, like I said, this is something that I haven't come across a lot as I'm traveling around, that you know, asking, having a solidified answer, however you quantify it, but just what does that cost? Is it annual? Is it by barrel? Is it by batch? Whatever. How much beer production is needed to achieve this based off your starting costs? So I'll talk about that in a minute. And then what efficiencies am I maybe missing out on that can help me get there if I'm not already there? So this is just a really quick demonstration of, you see on the left, this is an example of a production of a beer, 15 Plato, it's 10 barrels. And using a white labs culture, you'd pitch 3.5 liters of yeast to get the targeted recommended pitching rate. And we're assuming a yield of 80% or 198 pints per barrel. And we're estimating the yeast is going to grow 5 to 6 times after pitch. So you can see here that as you go through the generations in the center of the screen, this is just going up to Gen 6, but you can see how each time you use it, that price per barrel is going to be considerably reduced. So you're able to get down sub $10 per barrel just after a few generations. And the yeast, the quality of the yeast allows for this to typically go much further than 6, just based off of anecdotal, you know, situations that you know, customers I've visited. Like, it's not extreme to assume that you can get more generations than this. Yeast strain dependent, time in between use dependent. there are variables, but you're looking at 3.5 liters in, and then you are harvesting at I believe it's what is it, 1 to 2 liters per hectoliter repitch volume, I believe. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the exact repitching kind of calculation there, but yeah, you can see we're just going to harvest 10 liters, but if you're adding 3.5 liters and it's growing 5 to 6 times, you could expect to harvest 18 to 20 liters out of this batch. So you could get a larger harvest volume than what is necessary for the next fermentation. That's what's great about this, is you're essentially your own propagation facility. You're growing yeast as you're making beer. And if you're reducing stress on that yeast, you're propagating at a higher quality. So if we look at the next, this is just single reuse. Harvest, reuse once, harvest, reuse once, harvest, reuse once. This next idea is you can split those generations because you are getting a larger harvest volume. So if you only need the 10 liters, but you're going to get 20 liters because of that cell growth, you could split that into two separate brinks, and you now have your second generation yeast. I would call them split lineages. They're essentially like cousin cultures at that point, and they can then go into their own batches. So looking at that process, you're kind of multiplying production. This is heavily dependent on your production capacity, but looking at this process, you have a 20-liter harvest volume now using the same statistics. You can now split it up and create two batches at Gen 2. And then if you kept extrapolating this, 4 batches at Gen 3, or maybe just 2 batches at Gen 3, and you make 2 batches every time you go up a generation. These cultures are still at their generation and are still extremely healthy when properly handled and monitored. But now your cost has reduced very, very quickly, and you're at $6.50 per barrel just by Gen 3. This would be in like the $12 range if you were just to do 2 each time. So two at Gen 3 would be like 12 something, and then 2 at Gen 4 would be $6.50. And now, it's not outrageous to think we could get to sub $5 down to $2 per barrel using a high quality culture, getting really great flavor production. Double batching, I think, is a method I see and hear about the most probably. The really key thing here is you pitch the amount of yeast you need based on the fill on day 1. So if you're you're using a 20-barrel fermenter, 10-barrel brewery, you fill day 1, 10 barrels. You pitch for 10 barrels, you fill on day 2, 10 barrels, and the yeast has now, in that growth phase, grown up enough to continue growing and ferment that entire 20-barrel batch. So you're essentially cutting your yeast cost in half right away. And then there's the whole idea of ability to split generations and harvest and reuse that will greatly reduce cost very quickly. So this is kind of looking at this idea. This is like ultimate production ability. I know that for a 10-barrel brew house, this is probably extreme, but if you're on a larger scale with many large fermenters, this could be applicable. And you can see the point of this is just to show how quickly that price per barrel can drop when utilizing like a double batching and a split lineage method, or just double batching by itself. You will have a larger harvest volume because that fermenter is larger, and that harvest volume, if you were just to go into a single tank the next time, would be plenty to ferment that entire 20-barrel again. So you wouldn't have to employ like the same kind of double batching technique. You could brew like 2 10s in a single day and pitch the entire yeast slurry at once because you've now grown it up yourself. You don't have to buy it. And then a lager method that I'm seeing a lot more because that pitching temperature is typically lower in lagers. That reduces metabolic activity, or like the cellular division in yeast, so they don't grow as much in that first 48 to 72 hours. So you do need to add more yeast. It's kind of the same concept as high gravity. And so methods I've spoken with people about using is like just raising that temperature for the first 48 to 72 hours, getting that growth, so you can pitch less, and then reducing that temperature down after that, slowly, incrementally down, so that it's more in that lager fermentation range until it reaches the end, and you perform a diacetyl rest as normal. Another idea that is used a lot is like pressurized fermentations, pressurized lager fermentations. We have a high pressure lager yeast that is used commonly at 1 bar. You set at 1 bar, you have the high temperature, but the pressure negates the flavor production you would see at that high temperature, so it kind of balances out. So you still see a quick fermentation, but you see suppressed flavor production, and it doesn't require as much of a pitch rate, as high of a pitch rate up front, so you can lower the amount you need and have to purchase. another graph just kind of showing that utilizing this method, price drops very quickly. To compare this, if you were to pitch at 50 to 55 degrees, our recommendation doubles from 7.5 million cells to 15 million cells per mil, or typically you'd want like 1 to 1.5 million cells per mil per degree Plato. And that's going to essentially double your costs up front, which is tough because a lot of these lagers have longer tank residency times. You're not brewing them as frequently. You're not getting as many generations out of them, and also like they're not at a high price point, upon service. So those are all kind of tough points of making a cost efficient lager. So this warm pitching method can help negate some of those, or high pressure. The last thing to quickly talk about too is propagation, in-house propagation. So if you're brewery, like what to think about if I want to propagate my own yeast. And these are just some quick checklists items that I would consider if you were thinking about propagating in-house. So dedicated clean space. The reason why you really need to ensure this is and a knowledgeable, well-trained staff is because because propagating yeast doesn't produce alcohol, you don't have that defense mechanism. Also, you're starting out from a very low cell concentration and you're trying to grow it up. When you're pitching yeast into beer, typically you have a higher than when you're propagating, you'll start with a higher concentration, and then you have fermentation producing alcohol pretty quickly, and that'll help suppress some of those contamination aspects. But it's just harder to maintain sterility throughout the entire process and propagation. So you want to really ensure that you have dedicated space and staff. And then also just managing the scheduling so that you have the yeast ready to go. That can be tough, especially if anything comes up. And ensuring that you have a production method for the media that you're using, typically all malt, wort. Those are some things to think about. I think this conversation is very specific to your situation. I think some things you want to consider is, what is my price point? Like, what price point can I get to with yeast? So like, one, what am I targeting and what am I comfortable with? Two, what do I need to do to get there? And then what does the propagation in-house cost perspective look like? And comparing those two, because that may help determine, like, is it worth it? What is it going to take? What's the upfront cost, and how am I going to save and return that over time? And a lot of times this is really a situation just for like large regional breweries that that really makes sense. But that's not to say that small breweries aren't propagating their own yeast as well. So just really considering all these things is the best advice I would say that we can give in terms of should you propagate. This is a really quick example of quantifying your yeast cost, having a target, and thinking about what I need to do to get there. So this example is a $10 per barrel cost. I anticipated that a lot of people would be in this range, and as based upon the poll, it seems that to be the case, 10 to 30 or 10 to 20. And so based on your fermenting volume, how much you're making each batch, we have 1 through 60 here. This is the amount of beer production you need to produce over harvesting and reuse to achieve a $10 per barrel cost. And this is just a technique and a piece of advice for quantifying this. This is the way that we've been kind of thinking about it and trying to help breweries conceptualize it. Is so, like, if you're fermenting 5 barrels of beer at a time, you have house yeast, you want $10 per barrel cost, you need to harvest and reuse it 6 times. You need to produce 30 barrels of beer using that first culture to achieve this cost per barrel. And you can you can create this with any target cost, and you can create this with any brewery size. You can see that the amount that, and this is specific to our to White Labs based off of our product. And I think that the quantity needed for reuse for, like, especially for like house strains, this is easily achievable. The smaller breweries might struggle with just with like planning and scheduling and brewing enough to hit the quantity. But you can see, like, as you get larger, the amount needed to hit this reduces, the amount of generational reuse. And then on the small side, there's also the caveat of, like, you're predominantly serving through the tap room, so there is different margins to be thought about. So these are all just kind of like the business aspects or perspectives to use when thinking about your yeast costs at your facility. So in conclusion, harvesting and reusing does not need to be complicated, does not require expensive equipment. I think it really just requires getting to know your yeast cultures. Don't be intimidated. The better you know them, the better you'll be able to troubleshoot or identify issues. The better beer you'll make, the better flavor production in your beer for your consumers. I think all that's easily true. And you just need documentation, SOPs, and the equipment like a storage vessel to just hold the yeast in between batches. It's the best way to maintain quality and save on to get more value out of your yeast. Fresh pitches every time, no matter what the product is. It's going to add up over time, and so think about that long-term application. And then multiple generations of high quality cultures is going to lead to cost savings. So the cost up front of a high quality culture may be a little bit higher, but the idea is it's giving you more generational use. It's giving you the ability to produce a lot of beer with that single culture, and that is going to greatly reduce the price on the back end. So thinking about it like that, flavor, quality, and value are all intertwined in that conversation. So with that, just want to finish up by showing you a few resources that we have. Devin here has been putting together some great content on our Instagram, showing some recommendations for cell counting, for harvesting, repitching, all the things that we talked about today. There is our All Things Fermentation blog on our website. A lot of great resources in there, articles that will greatly help with this conversation and with other things. And then also our recent podcast on craft beer and brewing with Chris and Beechwood and Russian River talks about successful beer fermentation, conversations around zinc, and just some of the harvesting and repitching topics we talked about today as well. So with that, thank you so much for hopping on today. I took up the whole hour, so apologies for the long time, but I'm happy to get into some questions.
Sweet. Yeah. Thank you again, Jacob, for that informational talk on harvesting yeast. But yeah, it seems like we do have some nice questions throughout the lecture that pertain to some of these talks. So I guess the first one, when do you consider the best time to harvest? After fermentation and diacetyl rest, or do you do a yeast cold crash and then harvest?
Awesome. Yeah. And Devin, feel free to jump in with any of your thoughts too. But I would say the best time, so a recommendation is that you could harvest when you're about 1 Plato from terminal and before you do your diacetyl rest. Because then, like I mentioned, that yeast is not going to be accomplishing those last 2 tasks, and it is probably the earliest time where it's still going to be super healthy and ready to go. Just ensuring that slurry that you're taking out is a volume that you need. It's enough volume for your next batch. That can differ based on strain flocculation across different strains, and so it's kind of based on your application. But I would look there and then adjust from there.
Yeah, I would totally agree too. It's like the earlier the better. If you think about it, right, brewers back in the day used to harvest just top cropping and like got the freshest yeast possible, right? High Krausen. Nowadays, like what Jacob said, the ones in the cone aren't really fermenting much. So there should still be yeast enough for that diacetyl rest. If you're using something like a high flocculant strain, like an English strain or something, yes, re-rousing the yeast during fermentation should help clean up those processes. And then, yeah, like if you don't have enough yeast, yes, a cold crash is good, but you could think of it as a power nap. Sometimes, right, after you wake up from a power nap, you're more sluggish. So then pitching that sluggish yeast into the next one, you might have a longer lag time or other variables like that. So the sooner the better, I think is the statement of frequency, frequency, frequency. Um,
Yes.
I guess I'll do this next one, Jacob. I guess the next one is what's more like acceptable count of lactic acid bacteria from my yeast slurry and all that. Um, I guess the most ideal situation would be zero, but there's a lot of factors that come into play. I wish this was a more black and white answer, but it's really depending on like, hey, like it's the ideology of yes, my yeast is mainly going to outcompete this lactic acid bacteria. Sorry, um, but are these stray lab bacteria going into my soft goods and my gaskets or anything? Like, is it affecting the overall flavor of beer? And then how is my beer stored? Do I have full control of my beer of cold chain, cold storage, and I could taste and use my sensory to make sure it's still within brand of what I need it to, and I could reharvest a certain level of a CFU count and like create that standardized baseline for that beer or for that slurry. So it's gonna almost depend on a case by case basis. Ideally, again, zero would be the most ideal situation. If you do also want to like uh, push that boundary or like see how it might look in the future, you could always throw some of these beers or anything in an incubator to try like abuse them to see how it would really affect of like, hey, is this beer from this low count of lactic acid bacteria going to sour over time? And then would this population of lactic acid bacteria grow even more in my slurries? And then this is my acceptable range before I'm like, hey, no, there's way too much contamination that I need a new clean strain. I guess the next ones would be more of a propagation of ways to like prevent acetaldehyde in propagation or like certain media types that you might use in propagation. Uh, I guess for that, the number one thing would be like in propagation, nutrients, like what Jacob was saying of zinc. Zinc's always really, really good, and proper nutrition for that would help mitigates or help the yeast reabsorb some of that acetaldehyde, right? Acetaldehyde is always going to be formed because it's precursor to ethanol. Um, so it's making sure you have healthy enough yeast to help mitigate some of these formations. And then for like what's the proper media type, Jacob, do you mind going back to that slide you had of uh, showcasing your strain lineage and gravity and all that? So same idea of like wort's always the best thing to use to propagate. I know some breweries have like almost, I like to say a propagation beer of like a light blonde or something that could help yield as much growth as possible. Um, but just like planning your beer lineage, starting at a lower IBU, starting at a lower color, is always crucial. So we personally like to use wort as DME is always going to like add color to the yeast and could add color to that beer. So thinking of like what sugar source and what media type is crucial. If you just use straight dextrose as your propagation media, you could think of it almost as propagating it in a seltzer, where like a lot of times they get sluggish in that next batch of beer. So we always try to propagate in very beer-like substances to get them accustomed to that environment. Uh, Another question is, what's the minimum viability we recommend? We personally recommend 85% and higher. Anything lower, yeah, you are pushing it. I know a lot of dyes do not work as well 80% and lower. And then the lower you get, the lower percentage you get, you are technically pitching more dead yeast with that pitch because you have to pitch more volume. And then from that dead yeast, you might get italicized flavors and unwanted things. So on the safe side, we're always saying 85. It's even better if you go higher and higher, but that's safe bet is 85%.
Yeah, I would just add to that, like if you have used a lower viability culture, utilizing some of the things discussed in this talk is just like checking how it performed. Um, then you can determine for your own facility and your own process what you're comfortable with. There may be a limiting step there where like you've used multiple harvests at 77% viability before and they've turned out great, and then you don't use that culture again. Um, or maybe you keep using it, but like that's all solely based off of how you're seeing the fermentation go and how your beer is kind of tasting at the end and what you're comfortable with.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Jacob. Of a lot of times, that's the best indicator is how's your fermentation timeline? Is it slow and sluggish? Is it not looking the correct parameters, or is it flagging something? Because that's your best bet to be like, hey, this is a time to get new yeast, because bottom line is once your fermentation parameters get out of spec, it's not going to get better. There's not going to be some random aha moment of like, oh, I have this new gen and it's going to finally do a lot better than the previous fermentation kinetics. So looking at those fermentation kinetics like gravity and pH really, really matter. I guess the next one is if you don't have a big rotation frequency, any recommendations for storing your harvested yeast?
Yeah, there's some good content online about this from other manufacturers. And the one thing that we recommend is like we keep going back to nutrients. That would be something that like if you had a stored culture for a long time, but you have all the things around that culture good, like no oxygen, cold, no pressure. Having some nutrients to keep everything kind of happy, adding some would be a good step. Also, so this is going to be very strain dependent, so it's something to think about. Like a recommendation, I mean, to not to totally just like say use this strain, but like Kveik strains are very hardy over storage periods. And so like if you did want to get generational use and you were really considering your cost as like a main priority, you know, and you just need a clean strain, like looking at strains like that that have hardiness and are able to be stored for long periods of time would be another good recommendation, just for getting the most between those uses.
Jacob, do you mind going to your previous slide before this? But yeah, I would also say too of like choosing your house strain that really or you got the slide of the different house strains and all that, but choosing your house strain to fit as many different styles as possible is probably your best bet. Trying to keep your yeast as cold and without the introduction of oxygen. So we like to keep our stored harvested yeast almost like finished beer. To elongate as much viability as possible. But because frequency is always the issue, maybe it's a time to like use less strain variety and maybe try to like bank on like one strain that you could keep frequency a lot more going a lot more, because frequency is the number one thing of keeping them healthy, getting fresh new cells to use in that next batch. Ooh, another.
Um,
Oh, go ahead.
I was just say on the propagation aeration specifics, I don't have off the top of my head a recommendation on flow rate. I don't know if you do.
Yeah. Um, so a lot of times, like almost like how we were talking about DO, and DO really matters for that lag phase and that internal part of beer fermentation. It really depends on how much air or how much oxygen of those bubbles are getting into that wort. So it's going to really matter. I know for us, for like aeration and our sterile air, we do have like a sterile filter, and we are aerating very often, uh, just for the purpose of propagation. But for the purpose of beer making, we aim for that 8 to 10 ppm. Or if you're higher player, we go 1 ppm per Plato, and that's a good uh, eye for like I guess beer fermentation. For propagation, we're more on the higher side for aeration. And then Jacob, should you purge or bring prior to, before harvest?
Yeah, I would recommend purging your brink. easy to do and gets the oxygen out, so there's no risk of oxygen contact. The yeast that's coming out of the vessel has kind of went dormant. That's why it's flocculated down to the bottom. So any kind of uptake would kind of cause it to wake up. So I would definitely recommend just purging the brink really quick before harvest.
Yeah, also going off that oxygen too is if you do see a cell count after on your slurry from that brink and you do see a lot of budding, that is not a good sign. That means there is oxygen in that brink and your yeast have become like almost awake from their nap. And with that extra budding, a lot of times that's going to lead to a lot longer lag times and like not behave the way you want. So any oxygen ingress into that brink is not good. Multi-fill question, Jacob. How would you recommend pitching and aerating for batches brewed over multiple days? I guess the example they gave is a 120 barrel over 2 days, and either brew 3 the first day and 1 the second, or 2 the first day and 2 the second. Do you have like a volume or a certain strategy you like going?
So 1 the first day, 2 the second, or 2 the first day, 2 the second. I think. Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm properly understanding, but the big things is, I mean, you can aerate up until about 50% attenuation without negative effects. That's a common practice in like high gravity brewing. So if you're worried about how much wort you're adding off of on top of the amount you're pitching, definitely aerate each batch. Because you shouldn't hit a 50% attenuation that quickly. So there shouldn't be any risk with doing so. And I'm just trying to understand the splits, but the split, like whatever you're pitching or whatever you're brewing day one, pitch for that, regardless of if it's a one batch or two. But if you're, I guess the caveat is if you're brewing multiple batches day two on top of that first batch, that could be, you could run into under pitching. If you're only pitching, say like if you're doing 3 splits total on 120, that'd be like 40 barrel batches. If you're doing a 40 barrel batch, pitching 40 barrel, I'm not sure if that's correct. I'm just trying to use numbers to estimate. But if you're doing a 40 barrel batch day one and 80 barrels day two, yeah, I would definitely pitch for more than just that 40.
Yeah,
That's
I was thinking the same thing, Jacob, of like you pitch to that first day, but like if you are brewing 3 versus 2, you're going to be pitching more. But the number one thing I like to say is like cell growth equals beer flavor. So because I'm pitching more, because it's bigger volume, I might get less cell growth. So it's going to maybe reduce some of that yeast flavor. But if I really, really want to promote a certain yeast flavor, maybe I'll do those 2 batches and then fill on the second 2 to try to like get as much yeast growth as possible. So it really depends on almost like what you're saying of like pitch rate of saisons, Belgians. You're going to definitely underpitch to get as much yeast growth as possible. So that's the small caveat. So like it could be a small flavor nuance based off of uh, final volumes on that first day. Jacob, do you have any thoughts on pushing wort through the cone of a fermenter with the yeast bed already in there from the last batch?
yeah, I mean, you can do it and achieve great results. I don't think that it's one of those things that if you do that, you're going to always run into issues. I would say there's some things to think about. Definitely want to dump off that first layer of true, that lower layer before pushing in the beer, because I wouldn't want that to still be in there.
I was gonna also say, Jacob, there might be issues because in that cone of the fermenter, there's not really a cooling spot, so there's going to have hot spots and they're right in the middle of the cone. So any cone storage is usually not the most ideal place to store your yeast. Again, as you saw, like the best storage way, it would keep it cold, keep it asleep. But if you are filling it pretty quickly and getting that next beer on pretty quickly, you're going to run into less risk. But the longer it sits in that cone, the hotter it is, and the quicker the yeast are going to die off.
Yeah, that was the next thing I was gonna say, was that it's gonna be very time dependent on like the how it affects the practice. I would say like there's just a little bit more risk involved than if you were just to harvest it off into a brink and store it separate and then introduce it. Um but yeah, if it's really quick, I mean you will get really good um the yeast will be mixing into the wort really quickly, so you should get good like diffusion and good fermentation kickoff. It's
It
kind of
seems
situational based, what you see in your brewery and if it works for you kind of thing. But I would always recommend just harvesting it off the tank and then putting it back in.
yeah, it seems like the next couple of questions are a bit about propagation. I think one thing to really talk about propagation is how we're saying of like contamination and all that. Because for propagation you're using a lot less cells, and as we know, wort is such a nutrient-rich environment. You really have to be as careful as possible to keep it clean. So that's why we're talking a lot more about double batching and other ways to like almost propagate in your own brew house using beers. If you really want to go that whole propagation route of like getting a yeast spring with that sterile air and all those like different filters, it's a lot harder to clean and maintain. And that we do take a long time for our propagation because we are making sure for that purity and making sure for that, like what Jacob was saying, for that Gen 0 of the glycogen buildups, making sure they're robust and healthy. So there are a lot more factors and there are a lot more risk when propagating straight from like frozen slant onto a plate onto usually you do tenfold, but there's a lot more risk because there's not uh, almost out competing competition that you would have in a regular yeast pitch. Then I'm going to skip down to I'm not finding a good source for how long to let my alkaline methylene violet incubate with my sample when testing viability. We use the pre-made white lab solution. How long should I let sit before counting? Um, the most ideal time would be like 5 minutes. Um, usually the way I do it, depending on methylene blue or methylene violet, um, I'll mix it up and then put it on my hemocytometer and then put the cover slip on and let it sit for like 30 seconds to 1 minute to make sure the yeast don't move around, so it's easier to count. And then usually within that by that time I have like 5 minutes once I'm um, resting around or like cleaning some stuff up, and then I'll start counting. Longer than that, if you're already at like 15 minutes or so, that's where 15 to 30 minutes, uh, then even live cells and other stuff might start appearing dead. So make sure once you add your yeast slurry to your dye that you're not going on a lunch break or anything. Make sure you are counting it within that, I like to say 5 to 10 minutes. And then I guess another thing to note with the methylene violet versus blue, blue is the ASBC preferred dye for viability, but it really depends on preference on what dyes you want to use, and just understanding the different pH levels and what each dye does is something to look at. Yeah, and it seems like the other ones would be again propagation and all that of again, for propagation, it's going to matter. For propagation, you're going to really choose different yeasts depending on you want some sort of like generational variety, or sorry, cell variety. So it's really going to depend strain to strain on different propagation temps, how much how many strains you are picking to get that diversity, um, and then different ways to encourage glycogen reserves depending on what sort of sugar sources you're using or like what sort of propagation you are uh, making. So it's really going to depend. A lot of it goes down to what nutrients you are giving it, nutrient sources of like fan for nitrogen, as well as can't harp on enough zinc. As we know, zinc is now one of our best friends of aiding not only propagation but fermentation. And the reason why we're looking so much at the zinc is we are noticing a lot of these minerals are getting lost in the boil because they are binding the trube, and what rates you might think you have in your wort suddenly aren't there by the time end of boil, end of whirlpool.
Yeah, just to give my last 2 cents on these three last questions. It looks like we have for Tomas different inoculation rate using harvest yeast or propagated yeast. So like repitching, you mean? I think different rates than if it came from like propagation or a lab versus harvest and reuse. Literature will have different rates typically. Um, just because like viability might not be as high, so adding a little bit more to account for that, or if it's encountered some stress that's maybe lowered vitality. So like a safe literature like for like a safety net, I think kind of sometimes recommends 0.75 to 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato repitching for ales and 1.5 for lagers. Our pitching rates from recommendations from lab can be as low as like 0.5 to 0.75. So there is some differences there, but I do believe that like healthy cultures and good processes will not negate that those being sufficient enough to still see like healthy fermentations and good flavor production. So it's again situational based, but there is a difference in the literature there. So kind of just see what works for you. Cooling at the end of propagation. Like cooling does causes the cells to flocculate, which you need to harvest propagation, and it will cause glycogen storage to increase, so the yeasts have energy while in that dormancy. And optimum temperature propagation. I don't know the optimum temperature, but it is going to be warmer than typical ale fermentation temperatures, I believe. So it is warm because you're not as concerned about flavor production. You're really just trying to enhance metabolic activity in fermentation, where that's not our main goal. We kind of manipulate the yeast to give us the flavor that we want. So we kind of, yeah, we don't give them their favorite conditions possible, essentially.
I think we have time for one more question, so I'll go with the last one. How frequently should you empty and CIP your yeast spring if you're cropping from and pitching into multiple vessels?
CIP is copy from. I mean, I think safe practice would be to empty and see. So once it's empty, I would CIP it before introducing anything else into it, in case that harvested slurry from that was in it before had any kind of trace contamination. That trace contamination could just continue to grow as you fill it and fill it and fill it, because you could be introducing you're introducing wort that still has some residual sugar in it each time, and these are typically like CO2. They work fine in CO2, so I would definitely, anytime that brink goes empty, clean it, and then before you refill it.
Yeah, and I would also say, based off of Jacob's graphs, if you are pitching into multiple vessels, I would actually use multiple brinks from that harvested collection of like, okay, I know I'm going to harvest, so I'm going to have 2 or 3 brinks to harvest into, and that use that weight to then pitch into, use one brink to pitch in one fermenter and use another brink to pitch in another one. That way you won't run into like what Jacob's saying, of that contamination or any oxygen pickup in that space between of pitching from one vessel to another.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a safe practice, because then you can track it a lot better. Pitching multiple times from a single vessel, I think could just give opportunity for things to arise. Having multiple vessels in house, I mean, the ROI on that can be accomplished very quickly. I know there's a cost factor there, but I know there's also storage and space factor. But if they're not in use, they don't need to be in cold storage. And there's other products out there that can minimize storage space. So yeah, having separate pitchable drinks for each single batch. I would say it's the best practice overall.
Yeah, cool.
All right. Thank you guys so much. I just want to also emphasize my email is on the last slide. So if your question was not sufficiently answered, or you have other questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I will get you connected with, get the question answered or connected with someone who can definitely help you out. But I really appreciate you all for hopping on and sticking with us for an hour and a half. That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much for everyone for joining. Thank you again, Jacob, for this insightful talk. Please follow our socials like what Jacob was saying. And if you have any questions, email Jacob, email info@whitelabs.com or education@whitelabs.com. And we're always here to help provide resources and help provide answers. So please reach out and be on the lookout for the next webinar as well. So thank you, everyone.
Cheers.